They didn't tell me I needed to dance. Good morning, are you here? Yeah. Okay, I'm not going to do a call and response, but maybe every now and then I'll ask a question and pause and you can answer. So that's the title of my talk. My name is Madeleine, and I work for an organization called Education International. Does everyone here know what a trade union is? Put your hand up if you don't know what a trade union is. Un syndicat en français. Okay, so a trade union is a group or an organization or an association that brings together people from the same profession to try and defend their rights as workers and to think about the issues that might arise in that profession. So for education, maybe your teachers belong to a trade union, I don't know. But there are education trade unions all over the world that bring together teachers and other people who work in school who may not be teachers, but we call them support personnel, who are all there to make sure that the whole process of teaching and learning happens in as positive and constructive a way as possible. So those organizations are interested in making sure that teachers are paid well, that teachers' working conditions are decent working conditions. That's one side of the equation. But the other side of the equation is those teachers' organizations and trade unions are very concerned about the kind of education that you're receiving, what it is that their government says they have to teach you, and what you're expected to learn. So a teacher's trade union has two roles. One role is to defend the right to a decent work experience for teachers, but also to defend the right to education. And the reason I want to talk to you about the right to education today is because I think that this is not just something that we can expect only teachers or the politicians, the policymakers, or even the parents to be concerned about. I want to suggest to you that the defense of the right to education is your responsibility as young people. So, a little bit of a historical trip. After the Second World War ended in 1945, the countries who had been most prominent, played a prominent role in bringing the conflict to an end, decided that our chance of having peace in the world would be greatly increased if the countries of the world came together, first of all as a group in what became the United Nations, but within the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration covers all of these different aspects of human rights. Now, although the declaration is one that was signed, I think today there are 192 countries who are member states of the United Nations who've signed the declaration, this declaration is not a piece of legislation, which means that it doesn't exist as law in your countries. For it to become a law in your country, your government has got to do what we call a ratification, or they have to codify it in some way. So adopt a piece of legislation which brings the articles into the legislation of that country. But it's still significantly important as a symbol of a text, the first text of its kind, which put down in pen and paper our human rights. So there are four important things to notice about human rights. That they're universal and inalienable, they're indivisible, independent, and interrelated. So they're universal because, as I said earlier, everyone is born with them and has the same rights, regardless of where they live, whether they're a man, a woman, a trans person, whatever their religion, cultural, or ethnic background. All of those differences don't matter. Just by being a human being, you have those rights. They're inalienable because it means that no one can ever take them away from you. They're indivisible, independent, and interrelated because all human rights are linked. If you're enjoying number 16 out of the 30 human rights and numbers 15 to 25 are being violated, then we can't say that you are truly enjoying all of your human rights. So the violation of one is linked to the violation of other rights, as I'll explain later. So today, we're focusing on Article 26, which is the human rights to education. Did you all know that having an education was a human right? Did you know that before? What did you think it was? a luxury. Any other ways to describe education? Pardon? An obligation, a privilege. Okay, but much, much more basic than all of those. It is your human right. It's your government's duty to provide you with an education. And when you reach a certain age, it is your parents' duty to make sure that you go to a place where you can enjoy that right to education. So it's a human right. I want us to remember that because I think it's very easy to forget. When we forget about our human rights, the very foundations on which we can make any claims become a little bit shaky. Oh, I've pressed the button and switched it off. There's a technical guy behind here who is not there. It's back. Excuse me. Right. So there's a poem, I think, which this is all very interesting, and the things I said before are interesting, but I think this poem kind of captures, in a very succinct way, what the right to education is all about. So you don't have to earn the right to learn. It's yours. And if because of faulty laws and errors of design, and far too many places, too many countries, too many parts of different countries, still far too many people do not care. And if because of all these things and more, for me, the classroom door with someone who can teach is still beyond my reach, still out of sight, those wrongs do not remove my right. And I think a very powerful thing that comes from that poem is, no matter what is happening in your country, in your city, in your region, in your little village, if war comes, if there is a disaster caused by human beings, if there's a natural disaster, this right to education remains your human right. So within that list of 30 articles of the Universal Declaration, people tend to speak about education as being a human right, but also public good. And it's a public good because it's what we call an enabling right. So the idea is that if you have access to education, and I want to qualify that, if you have access to quality education, and that education does what we expect it to do, then the mere fact of having an education means that you are in a better position to demand that all your other 29 human rights are respected, because you'll know about them. You'll understand what they are. So the right to education enables you to learn, understand, demand, protect, promote your other human rights. That's one thing. We also say that education is a transformative right. So in the same way that you learn things through the right to education, what you learn can transform your life, very literally. If you get a good quality education, and an education that's, I would say maybe of its time and fits what's going on in the world at that time, and you are properly equipped to step from school into life, public life, private life, then your life can be transformed. You can choose what kind of profession you want. When you choose your profession, you're knowledgeable enough to make sure that you demand to be treated well. If you're a teacher, you might belong to a trade union, as I mentioned earlier. Whatever profession you're in, your life is transformed by the mere fact of having an education. And if you live in a part of the world where luxuries, privilege is something that's only enjoyed by the very few, then the transformative potential of education truly can't be underestimated. I'm sure many of you have seen footage on YouTube, on the other parts of the internet, documentaries, films, where they interview young people or older people and ask them, what's been the most important thing in your life? And they will say, my education. If I hadn't received my education, I may not have been able to change my life. I may not have been able to leave a situation of poverty, a situation of violence, whatever it might be. So when politicians talk about the right to education, they tend to often focus on the fact that it's a public good. And in being a public good, it means that citizens can live, hopefully, a better life. Sorry, it's hard to do all these things with just the two hands. So those are all the lovely, great things about education, but not everyone is enjoying the right to education. Who isn't enjoying the right to education? Well, there's some quite shocking statistics there. 65 million of the children who were estimated to be out of education in 2013, 17 million of them are girls. You can't read it all there at the end. 17 million of them are girls. And those 17 million girls will never, ever, 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 there'll not be any chance for them to ever step into a classroom. There are 781 million adults and 26 million young people worldwide who lack basic literacy skills. Again, the higher percentage of them are women and girls. Girls from the poorest households in the world, it will take us until 2085 before those girls will be entering school at the same rate as boys from the richest households. So you may have already also heard that we are making a lot of progress in terms of breaching the differences between girls and boys in all manner of different ways, and I will come back to that later on in this talk. But there are some parts of the world where girls are still very much at a disadvantage when we're talking about the right to education. Who else isn't enjoying the right to education? Well, if we think about disability, there are as many as 150 million disabled children in the world. And those children are 10 times less likely to access school than somebody who's not disabled. Less than half of the 6 million children who are refugees in the world at the moment are having access to any education at all. And if you think back to what I just said about the transformative potential of education, then you can see that their chances of really lifting or being lifted out of their situation of being refugees are very minimal when they can't even access education. Lastly, globally, 168 million children are involved in child labor. Child labor is a wide range of different tasks which don't include any kind of formal learning in the way that you know and understand education, but they're working, they're begging, they're collecting, they're doing all sorts of different tasks that the adults in their lives have asked them to do, or which they themselves decide to do because they don't have any other means of making a living in the world. Well, those 168 million children, of course, because they're working, they're involved in labor, and most of the time very exploitative labor, are not enjoying the right to education. Who is that? Sorry? Nobody in this room has heard of or knows who that is. Malala Yousafzai. She won the? Right. So I don't think was there anyone who didn't know her? Just put your name up real quick. Put your hand up real quick if you didn't know her before. I think I saw maybe one hand. The reason we know who Malala Yousafzai is because in 2009, her backstory is in 2009 with the support of her family and also the BBC. She became a blogger for the BBC. And she became a blogger because at that time in 2009, the Taliban took over the part of the Swat Valley in Pakistan where she was living, and they said, well, from, I think it was January of that year, girls will no longer be allowed to go to school or to access education. Prior to that, Malala had been, happily going to school with her other friends who were girls and enjoying the education that they were receiving. So when the edict came out from the Taliban, she was very concerned and found herself in a place where she had the opportunity to start to blog anonymously for the BBC about what was life like to be living in a place where one day you're getting up and going to school is normal, and the next day, because you're a girl, you're not allowed to go. So she was blogging about the impact that this was having on herself and on her other girlfriends. And going to school one morning in 2012, she's on the school bus, and an armed Talib gets on the bus and literally asks, says, "Who is Malala?" She indicates who she is, and he shoots her. And it could have been a fatal shooting. Luckily, it wasn't, and she was able to go to the United Kingdom to get treatment, and she's much better. She became really a global figure even before she won the Nobel Peace Prize. All over social media, everybody knew who she was, and everybody was talking about her. And she herself was, put in a position once she started getting better where she started to discuss why it was worth risking her life to defend the right to education. Why would Malala need to take that kind of risk at the age she was? I think she was 13 years old or 14 years old when that happened to her. Why is girls' education under threat in so many parts of the world? Does anybody have any idea why people may not want girls to go to school? They're expected to do something else, like stay at home, cook, children, clean, get married early, other harmful practices which may prevent them from going to school. But in the case of Malala, and Malala's not the only one, Malala's the face that we all know that's become a global icon. There are many Malalas in the parts of the world where she comes from, in other parts of the world. Girls' education, if you start to look at some of the literature online, and it's the position of many of the big organizations working in the field of education, is seen as something that's under threat. And it's quite literally threatened. The Taliban are very open about the way they feel about girls' education. Have you all heard of Boko Haram? Some of you heard of Boko Haram? Boko Haram is another armed military terrorist group, if I may be so frank, who operate in the north of Nigeria and have been moving out slowly into other parts of the African continent and countries in the Sahel, Niger, also Cameroon. And they're a group that say that they are, the words Boko Haram actually means Western education is bad. And they want to prevent anyone who they feel is accessing Western education from accessing that education. And that has meant that they are so bold as to go to schools and kidnap children, kidnap teachers, they kidnap girls, and they kidnap boys. And the boys they want to militarize, to join their military uprising. The girls inevitably are used for some of the things that you mentioned earlier, but also used and sexually exploited. So Boko Haram have been extremely active. Even if you haven't heard of Boko Haram, you may have heard of the Chibok girls or the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls campaign. Yes, some of you heard of that. That came about in 2014 because Boko Haram captured just under 300 girls in one go. They went to their school and kidnapped them. And as I stand here, today is the 12th of June, 2017, so more than 3 years later, not all of those girls have come home. I think just under 100 of them have been recovered. So there are parts of the world where people are actively and violently trying to prevent girls from accessing education because of an ideology, in the case of the Taliban and Boko Haram, or simply it could just be parents who are preventing their daughters from going to school because, like somebody said earlier, they don't believe that girls should be going to school. They should be doing other things that girls should be doing. And going to school and getting education is viewed as something more for boys because there is that split between private life, the domestic sphere, which is seen to be the sphere that girls should know most about, and public life, the public sphere, which is seen to be the natural sphere for boys to be more active and involved. So there are the military or violence or militarized acts and threats against girls' education. And then there's, maybe we could call that tradition or culture or even patriarchy, some of you may have heard of that word, some norms that define different roles for boys and girls to play in our society, which means that girls are prevented from accessing their right, their human right, remember, to education. So we could perhaps say the title of this talk was that the right to education is a right worth defending. In countries or in situations, some of the ones, such as the ones I've just spoken about, it's obvious and it's clear that in those situations we would expect that people would be demanding that right to education. They would want it very much to be defended. But what about in countries like the one we're sitting in right now, in Belgium, or Luxembourg, Germany, Norway, Sweden? Does the sentence, the right to education is worth defending, does that still resonate? Does it have any meaning? Is it meaningful? Is it meaningful for you to consider that your right to education is worth defending? Is it under threat? No, it's not under threat. I want to suggest to you that there are some ways in which it is. On the surface, we are not facing some of the issues around access to education. I see in front of me quite a mixed group of students, boys and girls. In fact, if I'm seeing correctly, there may be more girls in this room than there are boys, which is not the case in many other parts of the world. And statistics show us that even if we've got equal access, girls and boys are going to school at the same rates, the same numbers of boys and girls are going to school in our more developed countries. In some countries, some of the Nordic countries, in Western Europe, girls are indeed outperforming boys. They're coming out of school with higher grades, better results, and they're far outstripping their male peers. So it's the reverse of what we see in other parts of the world. So the issue of access may not be one that we would consider in countries like the ones that we live in or the one we're sitting in right now. But what about what we might call marginalized or minority groups in our countries, in our communities, right here where we are? So if we think about poor girls, there was an article in March in a British newspaper talking about a city called Leeds. Leeds is in the north of England. You may hear from my accent that I come from the UK. It's in the north of England. And a woman who I mentioned earlier that there are teachers in the school, but there are also support personnel. And she was in the school as a kind of assistant to the teachers. She was supporting their learning of the students. And she started to notice that a number of girls for maybe a week and a half, would just not go to school. They would just not be there. And then they would come back again. And initially the thinking was that, oh, these are just, bad girls who like to play truant and not show up at school when they should be, and they're out doing whatever it is they're doing. And this woman did a bit more digging. She asked a few more questions, and she tried to build a rapport with the girls who she noticed were doing this. And the bottom line was, when she finally got them to talk, was that they weren't going to school for those few days every month was because they were poor and they didn't have access to sanitary hygienic products. So when they were menstruating, they would just not go to school. I don't know how you feel about that, but in 2017, in the north of England, in Leeds is a big city, I was very shocked to read this and nearly fell off my chair, because the issues around having access to menstrual hygiene products are issues that I'm very used to reading about in Kenya, Uganda, Mozambique, India, Pakistan, countries far, far away, where it kind of makes sense because we know that there are huge issues around poverty and huge inequalities between people. So we would expect that, yes, girls are so poor that they can't afford those products. Not in the north of England, not in March 2017. So even as we sit here, if we start to look a little bit beneath the surface, there are people in our communities, in our societies, who are not accessing education as equally or the same weight as they should. So that's one aspect of the right to education. Also important are the rights that we get through education. What I said earlier about the fact that education is an enabling and transformative right, that means that you are acquiring other rights through education. If you are an Indigenous person living in the north of Canada today in 2017, then your chances of successfully going through education are very, very low, and in some communities, slim to none. There are high incidences of suicide rates amongst young Indigenous men in particular in the north of Canada today as we sit here. And the poverty in their communities, the inequalities that they face mean that they are not accessing the very fabulous Canadian education system at the rate at which we might expect them to. This is also true for Indigenous people in countries like Australia, New Zealand, the United States of America, etc., etc. Disabled children, where issues of access are much minimized in our communities and in our societies that we're familiar with, there are still issues. It is sometimes hard for teachers and other support staff in schools to know what needs to be done to ensure that a disabled student can be in class and participate in the lessons to the same rate as everybody else does. And that's not to fault teachers, but to think about when our policymakers are making decisions, when they're assigning money for education, how much of that money goes into supporting teachers and support personnel to make sure that they're in a position to make the classroom as accessible to everyone sitting there as possible. What about ethnic minority students? In countries like the United Kingdom, where they do gather data based on ethnic differences, so they call them ethnic minority communities, people who have been settled in the United Kingdom for a number of generations from different countries across the world, different Commonwealth countries or countries that were previously colonized by the United Kingdom. Those students are not performing or doing as well on the whole in education as we might expect. So there's a certain number of things, even in the wealthier countries, around your income bracket, so whether you're a poor person, whether you're a so-called minority person, whether you're an Indigenous person, whether you're a disabled person, whether you're a young person suffering from mental health. There's a lot of talk right now around mental health issues. That can also be a barrier to fully enjoying the right to education, even in wealthy countries. I also wanted to talk about the content of education, which is an issue, I think, a global issue, but in a community where we might think that everything is fine, I would like you to reflect for a moment on the content of your education. And I don't know how many teachers are in the room, but please bear with me. Do you consider, young people, that your education is preparing you for the 21st century? Do you consider that the things you're learning about and the way that you're taught are preparing you to be active, to be participatory, to feel empowered to play a role in your community, in your country, maybe on the global stage? Those are questions that you are entitled to ask yourself and to ask of the people who provide you with your education, because, why? Education is your human right. And it's important that we ask those questions, because if we want to ally ourselves with Malala or any other young woman or young man who is struggling to defend the right to education in some other part of the world, if we are not defending the content and our own right to education in the part of the world where we live in, then we put ourselves in a much weaker position if we want to build alliances, if we want to reach across borders and across other young people, ensure that they have full access to their right to education. So I want to suggest to you that the right to education is not a right that is the responsibility only of teachers or of policymakers or of your parents. I think the right to education is one of the very first rights that young people ought to become very concerned about. And in very recent times, just last week, there was an election in the United Kingdom where young people voted in much higher numbers because one of the parties had put the issue of the cost of tertiary education, so education beyond secondary school, as an issue on their manifesto. And young people reacted to that. So I think that it is something that you can hold decision makers accountable for and ought to be concerned about and should take the lead in, because the future belongs to you. And in many ways, you understand the present much better than the people who are in the decision-making powers, but you have the power to hold them accountable. Thank you.